Welcome to my video on 3-4 and 5 continued. Today we're going to focus on sketching the graphs of sine and cosine graphs. So we spent a lot of time picking out the features. Now we are going to actually graph them themselves. Okay. So the aim for today is to sketch a cycle of a sine and cosine graph. And the do now is kind of a review of how to pick out the important parts of our graphs. So find the amplitude and period and equation of each graph. So now we have to decide, is a graph sine or cosine, and then find its information from that. So let's start with our graph. Is this a sine or a cosine graph? Well, if we're looking at where it starts, right, and where it finishes, because it's starting at 0, we can definitively say in this case that we're working with a sine. Okay, so that would be something of the form a times sine b of x. Okay, so now how do we find our amplitude? Well, we look at the highest value, we look at the lowest value. If those two numbers are exactly the same, now they won't always be, but in this case they are, we can just take that value as our amplitude. So our amplitude is 2, and remember, it's always the positive value. What's our period? Well, the period is the length of one full cycle. So we can look at this graph and we see if we follow our cycle all the way through, it ends at 4 pi. Okay? So now we have to come up with our equation. What are we missing? Well, we're missing our b value, but we can always solve for the b value given our period. Because remember, period is equal to 2 pi over b. So if we substitute our period length, we can now solve for b. So let's do proportion. We got 4 pi times b is equal to 2 pi times 1. Divide by 4 pi on both sides. We get b is equal to 1/2. Okay, so what's my equation? Well, my equation here is y equals a, which in this case is 2, sine of 1/2 x. Now, it is a positive 2 because remember we are starting with an increase. If we started with a decrease, it would be a negative 2 in our equation. Okay, so let's take a look at the second one. Is this a sine or a cosine graph? So from what we've learned, we know that when it starts at a number, we are looking at a cosine graph. So our graph is going to be of the form cosine bx. Y equals a cosine b of bx. So now let's see if we can identify our amplitude. So our highest value is 5 and our lowest value is -5. So my amplitude, since those are the same, is going to be 5. What's my period? Well, remember, a cosine graph, if it starts down, one full cycle ends down. So in this case, it would be 2 pi. Okay, so now what's my equation? Well, again, we're missing our b value. So 2 pi is equal to 2 pi over b. Well, we know that that has to be equal to 1 then. So my equation here is y equals, now, is my 5 going to be positive or negative? Well, since I'm starting in the negative values, we know that this has flipped upside down because the one we worked on in the last video started a positive number. So if it starts at the negative, we know we're going to have to multiply by a minus. So it's y equals -5 cosine of 1x, which we can leave as just x. Okay, so now I want you to take a look at these graphs and their important features. Okay, what are some of the features we look at? Well, we see that we have our zeros. Those will always be important features. And we also see that we have a max and a min. Now, if we actually take a look at the graph itself, you should see that there are 2 boxes between the first 0 and the maximum on my sine graph. There's another 2 boxes to get to the next 0. Another 2 boxes to get to the next minimum. And another 2 boxes to get to the end. Okay, so what's happening here is we have a graph where its most important features are every fourth, right? It's divided into 4 equal sections, right? That's one section, that's one section, and that's one section. Okay, so we are going to be graphing these by dividing up our axis into 4 parts. The same can be done for cosine, right? We have our minimum. We don't actually have boxes here, but at our next zero, maximum, 0, and in the end, we're going to be breaking it up into the next 4 pieces. Okay, so that's going to be the main idea here, is breaking things up into 4. So let's copy this information down. To sketch a sine function. So if they ask you to sketch a single cycle, you must know the amplitude and the period. It can't be done without it. Okay, so do what you have to do to find those 2 pieces of information. And then what you're going to do is divide the period into 4 equal parts. At each 4th part, we are going to label it with 1/4 of the period. Okay, so we'll show you what that looks like. That will set us up to be able to plot the 5 key points that we need. The 3 zeros, and the max and the min. Okay, so we'll be able to connect those dots to sketch the sine curve. The one thing you need to remember is that it is a curve. So we don't connect them using straight lines, but rather with curved lines. So let's see how to apply this. So sketch one cycle of the graph of each sine function. So first step, you must know the amplitude and period. Check, check. Step 2, divide the period into 4 equal parts. So if I take this period of 4 pi and divide it by 4, I get pi. Now what am I doing with this pi? Well, basically that's going to be the interval on my x-axis. So I'm going to draw something every time I see a pi. So I have a lot of space on this graph, so I'm going to put every 4 boxes a pi. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4 pi. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now what is that? Well, that's pi plus another pi. That's 2 pi. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's 2 pi plus another pi. That's 3 pi. So we label that with 3 pi. And 1, 2, 3, 4. That's 3 pi plus another pi is 4 pi. By the time you get to the 4th measurement, that is where your curve is going to end. Okay, so now how do I sketch this? Well, because it is a sine function, we know that it starts and ends at 0. And halfway in the middle, we hit 0 again. Okay, so we have those 3 points. All that's left is to graph the maximum and the minimum. Now, since we're going to assume that it's positive, okay? So we're going to draw at our first spot, right, our first 4th, the maximum. So I'm going to skip 2 boxes. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Now I'm doing this just so I can spread out the picture. Of course, you want to fit it to whatever graph paper you have. Okay, but at pi, right, I'm going to plot my maximum. At 3 pi, I'm going to plot my minimum, which is -4. And now I have the 5 key points that I need to make a nice graph. So I connect my 0 to my maximum to the next 0, and so on. As long as it looks like a curve, you have graphed it appropriately. So now if we look at this, is it have the correct amplitude? Yes. Does it have the correct period, 1 full cycle? Yes. So we're good. Okay, so let's try another one. Sketch one cycle of the graph of each sine function. So we're looking at page 856, number 24. We have y is equal to 2 sine pi theta. So we need to know our amplitude and our period in order to do anything. Well, my amplitude is 2. And my period is, remember, 2 pi divided by my b value, which in this case is pi. So I can cancel these out. My period is 2. That means 1 full cycle needs to end when we get to 2. Okay, so we'll now take our period and we divide it into 4 equal sections. So 2 over 4 reduces down to 1/2, which for the sake of graphing, we're going to leave this at 0.5 just to make our lives a little bit easier. Okay, so that means I'm going to label 4 sections using 0.5 as my interval. So 0.5, 0.5 plus 0.5, right? We keep adding them. That gives me 1. What's 1 plus 0.5? That's 1.5. And that's going to be 1.5 plus 0.5 is 2. Okay? And that should be one complete cycle. So now all that's left is to graph the points. Okay? So if my amplitude is 2, right, we know the highest and lowest are going to be positive 2 and negative 2. So because it's a sine graph, we start at 0. Halfway in the middle we have 0, and at the end we have 0. Because it's a positive 2, right, we are going to have a maximum in the first spot and a negative minimum in the second spot. And I connect the dots. Connect, 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 connect. That is one full cycle of this. Now notice, if we look, there are different pictures, right? And what makes them different is that the scales here are going to be different. So you just want to make sure that there's even number of boxes between each fourth of my graph. Okay, that's the main idea here. So I picked 4 because I had a lot of space. Sometimes you want to do 2, sometimes you want to do 5. It really depends on the graph paper that you have. Okay. So I'm going to ask that you pause the video and give this one a try. So we need our amplitude, which in this case is 4. Remember, it's positive because amplitude's always positive. And our period, which is 2 pi over 1/2. So we keep change flip. So my period is 4 pi. I have to divide that period into 4 equal parts, which is pi. That means I'm labeling it every pi. So 1, 2, 3, 4 is pi. 2 pi. 3 pi. 4 pi. Oops. Okay. Now I plot my key points. It's a sine graph, so we have a 0 in the beginning, in the middle, and in the end. The only difference now is that this one is a negative, which means we're going to start by decreasing rather than increasing. So let's label my axis. 1, 2, 3, 4, negative 1, negative 2, negative 3, negative 4. So at my quarter part, right at the pi, I'm going to go down to a negative 4 because of this negative, which means at the second one, I'm going to go to a positive 4. So this is my graph connected. And there we go. We have one full cycle. And again, when you look at them all together, they do look different and they do have different scales. So